My name is Dalton Reeves. I'm a rock climber who survived the first 100 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted while I was guiding clients up Devil's Tower, the world ended in ash and ice. Using my climbing skills, I kept 12 people alive as glaciers swallowed entire cities and temperatures plummeted below survival levels. This is how we made it through when millions didn't. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dalton Reeves. I'm a rock climber who survived the first 100 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted while I was guiding clients up Devil's Tower, the world ended in ash and ice. Using my climbing skills, I kept 12 people alive as glaciers swallowed entire cities and temperatures plummeted below survival levels. This is how we made it through when millions didn't. October 15th, 2025. 2:30 in the afternoon. I was 400 feet up the southeast face of Devil's Tower with the Morrison family from Denver. Tom Morrison was a software engineer in his 40s. His wife Sarah was a nurse, and their 2 kids were twins, Jake and Emma, both 14. They'd booked a full-day guided climb, their first time on real rock. Tom was breathing hard, gripping the holds too tight like most beginners do. Sarah was actually doing better than her husband, following my instructions to trust her feet and stay relaxed. The kids were naturals, fearless in that way teenagers can be. We were on the 3rd pitch, about halfway up the tower. I had just finished setting up the belay anchor and was calling down for Tom to start climbing when the rock started shaking under my hands. At first I thought it was just a minor earthquake. We get them sometimes in Wyoming, usually small tremors that barely register, but this one kept going and going. The vibration traveled up through my feet, through the rock face, into my bones. I pressed myself against the cliff and looked down at the Morrison family. They were all frozen, gripping their holds, wide-eyed and scared. Tom was starting to panic, his breathing getting rapid and shallow. I could see it in his face, that look climbers get when they're about to make a bad decision out of fear. That's when I looked west toward Yellowstone, maybe 60 miles away across the Wyoming landscape. What I saw made my stomach drop into my boots. A black column was rising from the horizon, thick as a skyscraper, and climbing straight up into the sky like some terrible elevator shaft stretching all the way to the heavens. Even from 60 miles away, it was massive, darker than any storm cloud I'd ever seen. The earthquake stopped, but that column kept growing. I'd been climbing and guiding in Wyoming for 15 years. I'd studied geology in college before I dropped out to climb full-time. I knew exactly what I was looking at, and I knew we had maybe an hour before conditions became impossible. I keyed my radio and called down to my partner Jake Rodriguez, who was waiting at the base with our gear. Jake had been climbing with me for 8 years, running rescue operations and training new guides. He was solid, the kind of guy you could count on when everything went sideways. His voice crackled back up through the static, tense and urgent. He'd felt the earthquake too, and he could see the column from the ground. I made the call that probably saved our lives. Instead of continuing up, which would have been the normal response with clients this high on the wall, I told everyone we were rappelling down immediately. Tom started to argue, saying they'd paid for a full-day climb and hadn't reached the summit yet. I cut him off and explained that what we were looking at was Yellowstone erupting, and if we didn't get off this rock face in the next hour, we might never get off it at all. Sarah, being a nurse, understood emergency situations better than her husband. She backed me up, telling Tom to listen to the guide and stop arguing. The kids were scared, but trying to be brave. Emma asked if we were all going to die, and I told her no, but only if we moved fast and stayed calm. That was my first lie of the apocalypse, telling a 14-year-old girl that I could keep her safe when I had no idea what was coming. I started rigging the rappel anchors, working faster than I'd ever worked before. Every piece of gear had to be perfect because there would be no second chances. I used 3 bomber cams in a horizontal crack, backed up with a couple of nuts, and built a redundant anchor system that could hold a truck. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing through everything I knew about volcanic eruptions and what they meant for weather patterns. The descent took 45 minutes. I went first to set up intermediate anchors and guide the family down each rappel. Tom struggled with the technique, gripping the rope too tight and jerking himself down in uncontrolled drops. Sarah picked it up quickly, smooth and controlled. The kids surprised me by adapting faster than their parents, treating it like an extreme sport instead of a life-threatening situation. Halfway down, the wind started picking up, coming from the west with a smell I'd never experienced before. Sulfur and ash and something metallic that made your throat burn. The sky above us was getting darker, not like a normal sunset, but like someone was pulling a curtain across the sun. By the time we reached the base of the tower, Jake had all our gear packed and the van running. We drove back toward Devil's Tower climbing shop where I based my guiding business. The radio was going crazy with emergency broadcasts. Yellowstone had erupted in what geologists were calling a super eruption, the kind that happens maybe once every 600,000 years. The last one had ended the last ice age and nearly wiped out early human civilization. This one was potentially bigger. The Morrison family was supposed to drive back to Denver that evening, but I convinced them to stay at least one night. The highways were already getting clogged with people fleeing the ashfall zone, and driving in reduced visibility with panicked drivers was probably more dangerous than the ash itself. At least for now. We got back to the shop around 5:30, and by then the ash was starting to fall. Not heavy yet, just a fine gray powder that coated everything like dust. But you could feel it in the air, making your throat scratchy when you breathed. The temperature had dropped from 65 degrees when we started the climb to maybe 55 by the time we got back. That was the first sign that this wasn't just a normal volcanic eruption. My climbing shop was a converted garage with an apartment upstairs where I lived. It was stocked with enough climbing gear to outfit a small army, plus camping equipment, first aid supplies, and emergency food that I kept for multi-day expeditions. More importantly, it had a wood-burning stove, good insulation, and a backup generator. Without knowing it, I'd been preparing for this my whole adult life. Jake and I started making calls to other guides and climbers in the area. Cell service was getting sketchy, but we managed to reach most of our network. The Bridger Teton National Forest climbing community was tight-knit, maybe 30 or 40 people who knew the backcountry like their own backyard. Most of them were already thinking the same thing I was, that this remote location and our wilderness skills might actually be advantages instead of liabilities. By 8 o'clock that evening, we had 8 people gathered at the shop. Besides myself, Jake, and the Morrison family, we had Lisa Chun, a climbing photographer who knew the area better than almost anyone. There was also Marcus Webb, a former military guy who'd been guiding for 3 years since he got out of the Army, and old Pete Kowalski, a local rancher who'd been climbing since before I was born and knew every cave and shelter within 50 miles. The ash was falling heavier now, and the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. The emergency radio broadcasts were getting more serious. Scientists were saying the ash cloud could persist for months, potentially blocking enough sunlight to cause what they called a volcanic winter. Crop failures, global temperature drops, possible ice age conditions. Tom Morrison was getting agitated, wanting to drive back to Denver to check on his business and their house. I had to explain to him that Denver was directly downwind from Yellowstone, probably getting hit with heavy ash fall that would make driving impossible and breathing dangerous. Sarah understood the medical implications immediately. Volcanic ash in your lungs causes a condition called silicosis, basically turning your lung tissue into glass. Fatal if you get enough exposure. We spent that first night monitoring radio, broadcasts, and taking shifts watching the conditions outside. The ash kept falling steadily and the temperature kept dropping. By morning, there was 3 inches of ash covering everything, and the thermometer read 42 degrees. In October, in Wyoming, where it should have been close to 70 during the day. That's when I started keeping detailed weather logs, writing down temperature, wind direction, visibility, and ash accumulation every few hours. I'd learned in 20 years of mountain climbing that weather patterns could mean the difference between life and death, and I had a feeling that understanding what was happening to our climate was going to be crucial for survival. Day 2 brought more refugees. Word had gotten out somehow that there was a safe place to wait out the ash fall at the climbing shop. People started showing up on foot, having abandoned their cars when the roads became impassable. We took in a family with 2 small kids whose car had broken down 20 miles away. Then an elderly couple who'd been camping when the eruption happened. By the end of the second day, we had 15 people crowded into a space meant for maybe 6. I found myself making decisions I'd never had to make before: who could stay and who couldn't, how to ration food and water, how to organize work shifts for gathering supplies and monitoring conditions. It reminded me of leading climbing expeditions, but with higher stakes and no clear endpoint. The thing that worried me most was how fast the temperature was dropping. By day 3, we were seeing highs in the mid-30s and lows in the 20s. Snow was starting to mix with the ash, creating a gray slush that was somehow more depressing than either snow or ash alone. The radio broadcasts were confirming my worst fears. Global temperatures were dropping rapidly as the ash clouds spread across the atmosphere. I started thinking about a rescue I'd attempted 3 years earlier, something I'd never talked about with anyone except Jake. A solo hiker had gotten trapped in a slot canyon during a flash flood, and by the time we got the call and organized a rescue, I was 12 hours behind schedule. I'd rappelled down into that canyon with all the confidence in the world, certain I could save anyone from any situation if I just applied the right techniques and stayed calm under pressure. But when I reached the bottom, the hiker was already dead. Hypothermia and drowning, probably within an hour of making the distress call. I'd replayed that rescue 1,000 times in my head, wondering if I could have moved faster, planned better, made different decisions. The guilt had been eating at me for 3 years. Now, looking at 15 people who were depending on me to keep them alive in an increasingly dangerous situation, I was terrified of making the same mistakes again, of being too slow, too cautious, too late to save the people counting on me. But I also knew that my skills were probably the reason any of us were still alive. My ability to read weather patterns had given us advance warning of how bad conditions were getting. My emergency supply planning had provided enough food and shelter to keep everyone fed and warm. My experience managing groups in high-stress situations was keeping people calm and organized instead of panicking. Jake pulled me aside on day 4 and told me something that stuck with me through everything that came after. He said that most people were trying to survive this crisis by using skills and knowledge from the old world, the world before Yellowstone erupted. But that world was gone now, and the new world required different capabilities. The ability to live without electricity, without supply chains, without government services. The ability to find shelter and safety in places most people couldn't even reach. The ability to make life or death decisions quickly and live with the consequences. By day 5, the official emergency broadcasts were becoming less frequent and less reliable. Power grids were failing across the region as ash clogged air filters and electrical systems. The last government message we received told everyone to evacuate south immediately, to get below the ashfall zone and wait for rescue services that might never come. That night, I gathered everyone together and laid out our options. We could try to join the evacuation, loading everyone into whatever vehicle still worked and heading south with millions of other refugees. Or we could stay put, use our knowledge of the local terrain and our wilderness skills to ride out the volcanic winter in place. Both options carried enormous risks. Staying meant potentially freezing or starving if conditions got worse then. We could handle. Leaving meant abandoning the shelter and supplies we'd already established and trusting our lives to crowded highways and overwhelmed emergency services. The vote was closer than I'd expected. The Morrison family wanted to leave, understandably worried about their extended family and their life back in Denver. A few others thought our best chance was to get south while we still could. But the majority decided to stay, at least through the winter. We had enough food for maybe 6 weeks if we were careful. We had shelter and heat. We had people with medical training, wilderness experience, and practical skills. More importantly, we had something that most refugee groups didn't have. We had someone who could access places other people couldn't reach. My climbing skills meant I could get to supply caches, rescue stranded survivors, and find shelter in locations that would be impossible for most people to access. In the mountains, being able to move vertically as well as horizontally could mean the difference between finding resources and starving. I'd started noticing that the local wildlife was behaving strangely. Birds that should have migrated south weeks ago were still hanging around, as if they couldn't figure out what season it was supposed to be. Deer and elk were moving to lower elevations much earlier than normal. Even the insects seemed confused, some still active when they should have been dormant for winter. The weather patterns were unlike anything I'd seen in 2 decades of mountain climbing. The normal seasonal progression had been completely disrupted. Instead of gradual cooling as winter approached, we were seeing rapid temperature swings and unpredictable storm systems. My ability to read clouds and wind patterns, skills I'd developed to keep climbing clients safe, were becoming essential for predicting when it was safe to venture outside for supplies. On day 5, we got our first real test of how well our group could work together under pressure. A family with 3 young children showed up at our door, nearly frozen and completely unprepared for the conditions. They'd been trying to drive south when their car got stuck in ash drifts, and they'd been walking for 2 days with no food and inadequate clothing. Taking them in meant stretching our resources even further, but leaving them outside meant watching them die. I made the decision to bring them in, partly because it was the right thing to do, and partly because the woman turned out to be a teacher with experience managing groups of children. Skills that were going to be valuable as we figured out how to survive long term. But that decision also meant we were now at 18 people in a space, and with supplies meant for maybe half that number. I was going to have to start making supply runs to abandoned stores and houses, using climbing techniques to access buildings that other scavengers couldn't reach. It was dangerous work, but it was also exactly the kind of problem solving that my background had prepared me for. By the end of day 5, I knew we were committed to staying through the winter. The ash wasn't clearing. The temperature wasn't stabilizing. The government broadcasts had stopped entirely. We were on our own, and our survival was going to depend on how well we could adapt our skills to a world that no longer operated by the old rules. I started making plans for what we'd need to do over the next few weeks. Building better insulation and heating systems, establishing reliable sources of food and water, setting up communication with other survivor groups. Most importantly, training some of the others in basic climbing and rope techniques so they could help with the increasingly dangerous work of keeping us all alive. What I didn't know yet was that the dropping temperature and falling ash were just the beginning. The real test of our survival skills was still coming, and it would require every technique I'd learned in 20 years of climbing to keep the people counting on me from becoming another rescue I was too late to complete. Day 6 brought the first official government broadcast that made my blood run cold. The emergency radio crackled to life around 7 in the morning with a message that kept repeating every 15 minutes. The president was declaring a national emergency and ordering all residents within 300 miles of Yellowstone to evacuate immediately to designated refugee centers south of the 40th parallel. The broadcast listed locations in Texas, New Mexico, and Southern California where FEMA was setting up camps to house displaced populations. What terrified me wasn't the evacuation order itself. It was what the broadcast didn't say. No mention of when people could return home. No timeline for cleanup or recovery. No discussion of rebuilding infrastructure. The government was talking about this like a permanent relocation, not a temporary emergency response. That told me everything I needed to know about how bad they expected things to get. Tom Morrison heard the broadcast and immediately started packing his family's gear. He was convinced that staying meant certain death and that the government camps were their only chance of survival. I didn't try to stop him, but I did explain what he was likely to find on the highways. Millions of vehicles trying to use road systems designed for maybe a tenth of that traffic. Fuel shortages because refineries and distribution networks had been disrupted by the ash. Breakdowns and accidents blocking routes with no way to clear them. Sarah Morrison was torn between following her husband and trusting my assessment of the situation. As a nurse, she understood medical emergencies, but this was beyond anything in her training. The kids, Jake and Emma, were scared but trying to be brave. They'd grown attached to some of the other survivors, especially the younger children in the group, and leaving felt like abandoning family. The decision was made for us when Jake Rodriguez returned from a scouting trip to the main highway. He'd driven as far as he could before the ash drifts made the road impassable, then hiked another 5 miles to get a clear view of Interstate 25. What he saw convinced the Morrison family to stay. The highway was packed with abandoned vehicles buried in ash up to their windows. People were walking south, carrying whatever they could manage, including elderly folks, and families with small children who clearly weren't going to make it hundreds of miles on foot. Jake estimated there were maybe 50,000 people visible from his vantage point, all trying to move south on a single highway. He'd watched several fights break out over food and water. He'd seen at least 3 bodies that appeared to be people who'd collapsed from exhaustion or exposure. The organized evacuation the government was promising had turned into a chaotic refugee exodus with no coordination and insufficient resources. That same morning, we lost contact with the outside world entirely. The radio broadcast stopped around 10 o'clock, not with any kind of sign-off or emergency message, just silence. Cell phone towers had been failing progressively over the past few days, and now even emergency radio frequencies went quiet. We were completely cut off from any official information about what was happening beyond our immediate area. The isolation was almost worse than the physical dangers. For the first time since the eruption, we had no way of knowing whether the crisis was getting better or worse in other parts of the country. We didn't know if the government still existed in any meaningful way. We didn't know if the ash was clearing anywhere, or if the whole planet was experiencing the same conditions we were. I made the decision to start regular reconnaissance missions, to gather intelligence about conditions in the surrounding area. Using my climbing skills, I could access high vantage points that would be impossible for most people to reach. Radio towers, cell phone towers, tall buildings that gave clear views for miles in every direction. From these positions, I could track weather patterns, monitor the movement of refugee groups, and identify potential sources of supplies. My first major reconnaissance was to a cell phone tower about 8 miles from our base. I drove as close as I could, then hiked the last 3 miles through ash drifts that were now almost knee-deep in places. The tower was 150 feet tall, with ladder access to maintenance platforms near the top. Climbing it required technical gear because the ash had made the metal rungs slippery and unstable. From the top of that tower, I could see the scope of the disaster for the first time. The landscape looked like an alien planet. Everything was covered in gray ash, and the few trees that were still standing were leafless and coated like they'd been dipped in concrete. The Wyoming prairie, which should have been brown grass and sagebrush preparing for winter, was instead a uniform gray wasteland stretching to the horizon. More disturbing was what I could see of human activity. Smoke columns rising from what appeared to be vehicle fires along the highways. Small groups of people moving slowly across the landscape, dark figures against the gray background. Some abandoned buildings that looked like they'd been broken into and ransacked. The organized world I'd known 6 days ago was completely gone, replaced by something that looked like a war zone. The temperature readings from that tower confirmed my worst fears about the climate situation. Even at midday, it was only 38 degrees, and the wind was carrying more ash from the west. Normal October weather in Wyoming should have been sunny and maybe 60 degrees during the day. We were looking at temperature drops that would normally happen over months of gradual winter cooling, compressed into less than a week. When I got back to the base, I found that Lisa Chun had taken charge of organizing our supply situation. As a photographer, she was used to planning for extended trips into remote areas with limited resupply options. She'd inventoried everything we had and calculated consumption rates for 18 people. The news wasn't good. We had maybe 4 weeks of food if we maintained strict rationing, less if we took in more refugees. Lisa had also identified our most critical vulnerabilities. Heating fuel for the wood stove was going to run out in about 2 weeks unless we could find additional sources. Medical supplies were adequate for minor injuries, but completely insufficient if anyone got seriously hurt or sick. Most importantly, we had no reliable source of fresh water once the pipes froze, which was going to happen soon given the dropping temperatures. I realized that my climbing skills were going to be essential for addressing these problems. Heating fuel meant accessing abandoned buildings to salvage firewood, furniture, and anything else that would burn. Medical supplies meant getting into pharmacies and medical facilities that other scavengers couldn't reach. Water meant finding sources that were protected from ash, contamination, and figuring out how to transport it back to our base. The next few days established a pattern that would define our survival strategy. I would make daily reconnaissance and supply runs, using climbing techniques to access resources that were out of reach for most survivors. The rest of the group would maintain the base, care for the children, and work on improving our shelter and defenses. My first major supply run was to an abandoned pharmacy about 12 miles away. The building was a single-story structure, but the roof was the only way in because the doors and windows had been barricaded by the owner before he evacuated. I used standard building access techniques, rappelling down from the roof and cutting through a skylight to get inside. The pharmacy was mostly cleaned out, but I found antibiotics, pain medications, and first aid supplies that the looters had missed because they were stored in a locked cabinet. More importantly, I found insulin in a refrigerated case that was still working because the building's backup generator was running. That insulin probably saved the life of one of our group members who turned out to be diabetic, but hadn't told anyone because he was afraid of being seen as a burden. During that same supply run, I encountered my first group of hostile survivors. 3 men armed with hunting rifles who demanded that I hand over everything I'd collected. They were clearly desperate, probably hadn't eaten in days, but they were also making the mistake of trying to rob someone who was wearing a climbing harness and carrying technical gear they didn't understand. I ended up escaping by rappelling off the back of the building and disappearing into terrain they couldn't follow. But the encounter taught me that resource competition was going to become increasingly violent as more people ran out of food and supplies. My ability to access places other people couldn't reach was going to be both an advantage and a target for anyone desperate enough to take by force. The psychological pressure of being responsible for 18 people's survival was starting to wear on me. Every decision I made could mean the difference between life and death for the entire group. Every supply run carried the risk that I might not come back, leaving them without anyone who could access the resources they needed to survive. I found myself thinking more and more about that failed rescue 3 years ago. The solo hiker who'd died in the Slot Canyon while I was still organizing the rescue operation. I'd been so careful, so methodical in my planning, making sure every piece of equipment was perfect and every safety protocol was followed. But while I was being careful, someone was dying because I wasn't fast enough. Now I was facing the same choice on a much larger scale. I could be cautious and systematic, minimizing risks but potentially moving too slowly to keep everyone alive. Or I could take bigger risks, move faster, and accept that some of my decisions might get people killed, including myself. The difference was that this time, I didn't have the luxury of taking my time to plan the perfect rescue. Day 12 brought our first real medical emergency. Marcus Webb, the former military guy who'd been helping with security and supply organization, developed what appeared to be pneumonia from breathing volcanic ash despite our makeshift filter masks. His breathing became labored, he was running a fever, and he was coughing up blood. Sarah Morrison, being a nurse, did everything she could with the medical supplies we had, but it was clear that Marcus needed hospitalization and treatments we couldn't provide. The nearest hospital was 40 miles away in a city that was probably completely evacuated. Even if we could get him there, the facility was likely abandoned or overwhelmed with patients they couldn't treat. I made the decision to attempt a supply run to that hospital, not to bring Marcus there, but to bring back whatever medical equipment and medications I could salvage. It was the most dangerous mission I'd attempted since the eruption, requiring a 60-mile round trip through increasingly hostile territory to access a building that might be heavily defended or completely cleaned out. The hospital mission took 3 days and nearly got me killed twice. The building was partially collapsed from the weight of ash accumulation on the roof, but the basement levels were intact and contained most of the pharmacy and medical storage areas. I had to navigate through unstable structure using technical rescue techniques, basically treating the building like a vertical cave system. I managed to retrieve antibiotics, 4 fluids, and portable medical equipment that Sarah could use to treat Marcus's pneumonia. More importantly, I found a cache of respiratory medications that would help all of us deal with the long-term effects of ash exposure. But the mission also showed me how quickly infrastructure was deteriorating. Buildings that had been designed to last decades were failing after less than 2 weeks of ash loading and neglect. By day 15, we were starting to see the next phase of the climate crisis. The daily temperature swings were becoming more extreme. Daytime highs barely reached freezing, while nighttime lows were dropping into the teens. Snow was now mixing regularly with the ashfall, creating a gray slush that was somehow more depressing than either snow or ash alone. The wildlife behavior I'd been monitoring was becoming increasingly strange. Animals that should have migrated south were dying instead, apparently unable to navigate in the reduced visibility and disrupted seasonal cues. I found deer and elk carcasses that appeared to be from starvation rather than cold, suggesting that the ash was contaminating their food sources. Most disturbing was the complete absence of birds. Species that lived in this area year-round had either died or fled, leaving an eerie silence that made the landscape feel completely lifeless. The ecological disruption was happening faster than anyone had predicted, and it suggested that the environmental damage was going to be much more severe and long-lasting than even the worst-case scenarios. Our group dynamics were also evolving. Under the pressure, people were naturally separating into different roles based on their skills and personalities. Sarah Morrison had become our medical officer. Lisa Chun was managing supplies and logistics. Pete Kowalski, the old rancher, was teaching people practical skills like food preservation and equipment maintenance. Jake Rodriguez was handling security and helping me with the more dangerous supply runs. But the stress was also creating conflicts. Some people thought I was taking unnecessary risks with the long-distance supply missions. Others thought I wasn't moving fast enough to secure the resources we needed for long-term survival. Everyone was scared, and fear was making some people question decisions they would have accepted without argument under normal circumstances. The children were adapting better than the adults in some ways. Jake and Emma Morrison had taken charge of the younger kids, organizing activities to keep them busy and maintaining something like a normal routine despite the circumstances. But I could see the psychological impact in their behavior. They were quieter, more serious, aged beyond their years by experiences no child should have to live through. Day 18 brought news that changed everything about how I understood our situation. During a reconnaissance mission to a radio tower 20 miles south, I managed to pick up a weak signal from a government emergency broadcast originating somewhere in Colorado. The message was brief and mostly unintelligible due to static, but I caught enough to understand that refugee camps in the South were being overwhelmed and closed to new arrivals. The broadcast mentioned that supply deliveries to the camps had been suspended indefinitely due to transportation disruptions. Facilities designed for 10,000 people were housing 50,000 or more. Disease outbreaks were causing massive casualties. The government evacuation that was supposed to save people was turning into a humanitarian disaster that might be worse than staying in the ash zone. That intelligence confirmed my decision to keep our group in place, but it also meant that we were truly on our own. There would be no rescue services coming to help us, no government aid or resupply operations, no evacuation if things got worse than we could handle. Our survival depended entirely on our ability to adapt to conditions that were continuing to deteriorate. I started planning for scenarios that would have seemed impossible 3 weeks earlier. What if the volcanic winter lasted for years instead of months? What if the ash contamination made agriculture impossible in most of North America? What if the infrastructure damage was so extensive that normal commerce and transportation never resumed? My climbing background was giving me advantages I hadn't fully appreciated before the crisis. The mental discipline required for technical climbing, the ability to stay calm and think clearly while your life hangs by a rope, was exactly what was needed for making life or death decisions under extreme stress. The physical fitness and technical skills were obvious benefits, but the psychological preparation was equally important. More importantly, my experience with risk management in climbing was translating directly to survival planning. In climbing, you always have backup plans for when things go wrong. Multiple anchor points in case one fails. Escape routes if the weather turns bad. Contingency plans for medical emergencies in remote locations. The same thinking applied to surviving an apocalyptic scenario, just on a larger scale. By day 20, our situation had stabilized enough that I could start thinking beyond immediate survival needs. We had adequate food for another month if we maintained rationing. Our shelter was secure and properly heated. Medical supplies were sufficient for routine health care. Most importantly, we'd established reliable methods for accessing additional resources when we needed them. But I was also starting to notice signs that made me worry about what was coming next. The ashfall was decreasing, but the temperature was continuing to drop faster than normal seasonal cooling would explain. Weather patterns were becoming increasingly chaotic, with sudden storms that appeared without the usual warning signs I'd learned to read during 2 decades of mountain climbing. Most concerning were subtle changes in the landscape that suggested the crisis was entering a new phase. Snow and ice were accumulating in ways that didn't match normal winter patterns. Rock formations were showing stress fractures from repeated freeze-thaw cycles happening much faster than usual. The geological instability that had triggered the initial eruption seemed to be continuing in less dramatic but potentially more dangerous ways. I started keeping detailed records of everything I observed during my reconnaissance missions. Temperature readings, wind patterns, snow accumulation, infrastructure damage, wildlife behavior, and human activity. The data was painting a picture of environmental changes that were accelerating rather than stabilizing. The volcanic winter was just the beginning of a much larger climate disruption. 25 days after the eruption, I climbed the highest accessible peak in our area to get a comprehensive view of regional conditions. From 4,000 feet above our base, I could see for maybe 30 miles in every direction. What I saw convinced me that the people depending on me for survival were going to need every skill I'd learned in 20 years of climbing, and probably some I hadn't learned yet. The highways were completely abandoned now, buried under ash and snow drifts that would take heavy equipment months to clear. Entire towns were disappearing under white and gray accumulation that was already several feet deep and growing daily. Most disturbing was the complete absence of any signs of organized human activity. No vehicle movement, no aircraft, no evidence of government or military operations anywhere within my range of vision. We were living in a world that had been set back to pre-industrial conditions, but without the knowledge and infrastructure that had allowed people to survive in those conditions historically. The skill sets that were going to matter for long-term survival were things like wilderness navigation, food preservation, basic medicine, and the ability to create shelter and tools from scavenged materials. My climbing background had given me most of these capabilities, but I was one person responsible for keeping 18 people alive in conditions that were continuing to get worse. The next phase of our survival was going to require training others in skills they'd never needed before the eruption. More importantly, it was going to require preparing for challenges that I could see coming but couldn't yet fully understand. The weather patterns I was observing suggested that the temperature drops and increased precipitation were going to continue for much longer than anyone had predicted. The infrastructure damage was so extensive that normal supply chains and transportation networks might never be rebuilt. Most critically, the rate of environmental change was accelerating in ways that made long-term planning almost impossible. Day 26 brought the kind of weather that made me realize we were dealing with something far beyond a normal volcanic winter. The temperature dropped to 8 degrees below zero overnight, which was unheard of for late October in Wyoming. More concerning was how fast the change happened. In the span of 6 hours, we went from just below freezing to conditions that would kill an unprepared person in minutes. I was monitoring these changes obsessively now, taking readings every few hours and comparing them to historical weather data I'd collected during 20 years of guiding climbs in the region. What I was seeing violated every pattern I understood about seasonal temperature transitions. Instead of gradual cooling, over months, we were experiencing the kind of temperature drops that normally took an entire winter, compressed into days. The North Platte River, which had been flowing normally just a week earlier, was now frozen solid from bank to bank. I'd never seen that happen in October, not even during the harshest winters on record. When I walked out onto the ice to test its thickness, it was already strong enough to support a vehicle. That told me the deep cold wasn't a temporary weather system, but a fundamental shift in our regional climate. Jake Rodriguez and I started making longer reconnaissance missions to understand how widespread these changes were. What we found was both terrifying and strategically important for our survival planning. Rivers and lakes throughout the region were freezing at rates that suggested winter conditions were arriving months ahead of schedule and with unprecedented severity. During one of these missions, we encountered something that would haunt me for the rest of this crisis. We were approaching an abandoned ranch house about 15 miles from our base when we saw smoke rising from the chimney. Thinking we'd found other survivors, we approached carefully and called out to identify ourselves. The response came from a man named David Chun, no relation to Lisa from our group. He'd been trying to keep his family alive in the ranch house for 3 weeks since the eruption. His wife and 2 young children were all suffering from severe respiratory problems caused by ash exposure, despite his efforts to seal the building and create clean air spaces. David had medical training as a paramedic, but he didn't have the medications or equipment needed to treat volcanic ash poisoning. His wife was barely conscious, and the children were coughing up blood. He'd been trying to reach medical facilities for weeks, but his vehicle had broken down and the nearest hospital was over 60 miles away through impassable terrain. I made the decision to attempt an emergency medical supply run specifically for David's family. There was a veterinary clinic about 20 miles away that might have respiratory medications and oxygen equipment that could help. It was a dangerous mission through increasingly hostile territory, but these were 4 people who would certainly die without intervention. The veterinary clinic was in a small town that had been completely evacuated. The building was intact, but getting inside required technical climbing skills because all the doors and windows had been secured. I rappelled down from the roof and cut through a skylight, just like I'd done at the pharmacy weeks earlier. Inside, I found exactly what I'd hoped for: veterinary medications that could treat respiratory distress, portable oxygen concentrators designed for animal surgery, and 4 fluids that were compatible with human medical needs. More importantly, I found antibiotics that were specifically effective against the lung infections caused by volcanic ash exposure. The trip back to David's ranch took 8 hours through deteriorating weather conditions. By the time I arrived, his wife had lost consciousness and one of the children was showing signs of severe oxygen deprivation. Sarah Morrison had come with me to provide medical support, and she immediately started 4 treatments and oxygen therapy using the equipment I'd retrieved. We managed to stabilize the family enough to transport them back to our base. It was a complex operation that required rigging a sled system to move 4 people who couldn't walk through snow and ash drifts that were now waist-deep in places. The technical rope work involved was similar to glacier rescue techniques I'd learned during alpine climbing, but adapted for moving multiple patients across flat terrain. David Chun turned out to be an incredible addition to our group. His paramedic training complemented Sarah Morrison's nursing background, giving us much better medical capabilities. More importantly, his experience with emergency response and resource management helped us organize our survival operations more efficiently. But saving David's family also taught me something disturbing about the timeline we were facing. They'd been trapped in that ranch house for 3 weeks, and in that time, conditions had deteriorated so rapidly that a distance of 15 miles had become almost impossible to travel. The landscape was changing faster than people could adapt, trapping survivors in situations where they couldn't reach help or resources. Day 30 brought our first encounter with organized hostile survivors. I was conducting a supply run to an abandoned grocery store when I was approached by a group of 8 people who were clearly operating as a coordinated scavenging team. They were armed with hunting rifles and had vehicles that they'd modified for travel through ash and snow. Their leader, a man who introduced himself only as Captain Martinez, explained that they were collecting tribute from all the survivor groups in the region: food, fuel, medical supplies, and weapons in exchange for protection from other hostile groups. The implication was clear: pay them or become targets for elimination. I told Martinez that our group didn't have enough supplies to share, which was true. But I also made it clear that we weren't helpless. I was wearing climbing gear and carrying equipment that most people didn't understand, which gave me an advantage. In terms of perception, they knew I could access places they couldn't reach, which meant I could potentially threaten their supply sources. The confrontation ended without violence, but it established a pattern that would define much of the next month. Resource competition was becoming militarized as survivor groups grew larger and more desperate. My climbing skills were becoming both a defensive advantage and a target for people who wanted to control access to elevated supply caches. More importantly, that encounter made me realize that our isolation was both protecting us and making us vulnerable. We were hidden enough to avoid casual detection, but we were also cut off from potential allies and trading partners. I started planning reconnaissance missions specifically to identify other survivor groups that might be willing to cooperate rather than compete. The next few weeks established a routine of increasingly dangerous supply runs, punctuated by encounters with both hostile and friendly survivor groups. I found families trapped in remote locations who needed rescue. I discovered well-organized communities that were thriving through cooperation and resource sharing. I also encountered groups that had turned to violence and theft as their primary survival strategy. Each of these encounters taught me something important about how different people were adapting to the crisis. The groups that were surviving best had leaders with military or emergency response backgrounds, clear organizational structures, and diverse skill sets among their members. The groups that were struggling or turning hostile typically lacked leadership, had no long-term planning capabilities, and were focused entirely on immediate needs. Our group was somewhere in the middle. We had good leadership and organization, but we were small enough to be vulnerable to larger hostile groups. We had excellent medical and technical capabilities, but we were isolated from potential allies and trading partners. Most critically, we were entirely dependent on my climbing skills for accessing resources, which created a single point of failure that could doom everyone if something happened to me. Day 38 brought the weather event that convinced me we were dealing with something far more severe than a volcanic winter. A storm system moved through the region that combined heavy snow, freezing rain, and winds strong enough to damage buildings. But what made it unprecedented was the temperature drop that accompanied it. In 12 hours, the temperature fell from 20 degrees to 30 below zero. That's a 50-degree temperature drop in half a day, something that should be meteorologically impossible under normal circumstances. The wind chill made outdoor conditions lethal within minutes of exposure. Anyone caught outside without proper shelter would have died before they could find safety. The storm also brought something I'd never seen before in Wyoming. Ice precipitation that wasn't quite snow and wasn't quite hail, but created accumulations that were incredibly dangerous for anyone trying to travel. The ice formed layers that would support a person's weight for a few steps, then collapse without warning into snowdrifts that could be 8 or 10 feet deep. I realized that these weren't normal weather patterns, but climate chaos caused by the massive atmospheric disruption from the volcanic eruption. Traditional weather prediction methods were useless because the fundamental systems that drove regional climate had been completely altered. My ability to read natural signs and predict dangerous conditions was one of the few reliable methods for staying safe during outdoor operations. During that same storm, we received a distress signal that would test every skill I'd developed as a climber and rescue specialist. A family of 5 was trapped in a vehicle on an overpass about 12 miles from our base. Their car had broken down during the storm, and they were slowly freezing to death in temperatures that would kill them within hours. The rescue operation required everything I'd learned about technical rope work, cold weather survival, and emergency medical treatment. The overpass was 40 feet above the ground, accessible only by climbing the concrete support pillars that were now coated with ice. Getting to the vehicle meant ascending a vertical ice climb in near whiteout conditions. I used ice climbing techniques to ascend the support pillar, carrying a full rescue kit including ropes, anchors, and medical supplies. The family inside the car was hypothermic but conscious when I reached them. 2 adults and 3 children, including an infant, who was showing signs of severe cold exposure that could be fatal within minutes. The evacuation required rigging a complex pulley system to lower 5 people down from the overpass to ground level, where Jake Rodriguez was waiting with our vehicle. Each person had to be secured in a harness and lowered individually, a process that took over an hour in conditions that were actively trying to kill all of us. The infant required immediate medical intervention that Sarah Morrison and David Chun provided during the transport back to our base. We managed to save all 5 people, but it was the closest call we'd had since the crisis began. The experience taught me that winter rescue operations in these conditions were going to require techniques I'd never used before. Combinations of technical climbing and cold weather medicine that pushed the limits of what was possible. But that rescue also triggered memories of the failure that had been haunting me for 3 years. The solo hiker in the Slot Canyon who died while I was still organizing the rescue operation. This time, I'd moved fast enough and taken enough risks to save everyone, but the parallel was unmistakable. Once again, people were dying because they couldn't reach safety, and my technical skills were the only thing standing between survival and death. The psychological pressure of being responsible for so many lives was intensifying as conditions became more dangerous. Every supply run carried the risk that I might not return, leaving 23 people without anyone who could access the resources they needed to survive. Every rescue attempt meant exposing myself to potentially fatal conditions, with no backup if something went wrong. Day 45 brought intelligence that changed how I understood the timeline we were facing. During a reconnaissance mission to a radio tower 30 miles from our base, I managed to intercept weak communications from what appeared to be a government facility somewhere in Colorado. The transmissions were mostly encrypted, but I caught enough clear text to understand that official estimates for recovery were being measured in decades, not years. The communications mentioned ice sheet advancement, infrastructure collapse, and population displacement on a scale that suggested the volcanic winter was transitating into something much more permanent. References to agricultural zones, strategic resource reserves, and population consolidation indicated that the government was planning for a fundamentally different world rather than recovery to pre-eruption conditions. That intelligence confirmed my worst fears about what we were facing. This wasn't a temporary crisis that would resolve when the ash cleared and temperatures normalized. The climate disruption was triggering feedback loops that were going to persist long after the direct effects of the eruption ended. We were looking at permanent changes to how human civilization functioned in North America. I started planning for scenarios that extended far beyond the next few months. What if normal agriculture was impossible for years? What if transportation and communication networks were never rebuilt to pre-crisis levels? What if the temperature changes and extreme weather became the new normal rather than temporary disruptions? My climbing background was giving me advantages for long-term survival that I hadn't fully appreciated before. The ability to live self-sufficiently in remote locations with minimal resources. The mental discipline to make life or death decisions under extreme stress. The technical skills to access resources and shelter that other people couldn't reach. These capabilities were going to be essential not just for surviving the immediate crisis, but for adapting to a permanently changed world. Day 50 brought our first major equipment failure that could have killed everyone. The wood-burning stove that was heating our base developed a crack in the firebox that allowed carbon monoxide to leak into our living space. David Chun's medical training probably saved us by recognizing the symptoms before anyone died, but it was a reminder of how dependent we were on systems that could fail without warning. Repairing the stove required metalworking skills that none of us possessed, but I managed to jury-rig a temporary fix using materials salvaged from an abandoned auto repair shop. The operation required rappelling into the shop, through a collapsed roof section, and cutting through twisted metal to reach the welding equipment I needed. But the stove failure also made me realize how vulnerable we were to single-point failures. In our survival systems, heating, water supply, Food storage, medical equipment, and communication gear were all essential, and failure of any one system could doom the entire group. I started planning redundant systems and backup capabilities for everything we depended on. The most critical vulnerability was my role as the only person who could access elevated resource locations. If something happened to me during a supply, run or rescue operation, the group would lose their primary means of obtaining food, medical supplies, and equipment. I started training Jake Rodriguez and a few others in basic climbing techniques so they could at least attempt simple supply missions if necessary. Day 55 brought the weather observation that convinced me we were about to face an entirely new category of threat. Using binoculars from a radio tower, I could see white accumulation on mountain peaks that normally didn't show snow until December. But this wasn't normal snow accumulation. The pattern suggested that mountain glaciers were not just growing, but advancing down valleys at rates that were visible from day to day. I'd studied enough geology to understand what that meant. Glacial advancement at observable speeds indicated that the climate cooling was severe enough to trigger ice age conditions. Not the gradual glacier growth that happened over centuries, but rapid ice sheet formation that could advance miles per year under the right conditions. From my vantage point 30 miles away, I could track the daily progress of ice moving down mountain valleys toward the lower elevations where human settlements were located. The rate of advancement suggested that our current location might be threatened by glacial ice within months rather than years. That observation changed everything about our long-term survival planning. We weren't just dealing with a harsh winter. That would eventually end. We were potentially in the path of advancing glaciers that could make our current location uninhabitable, regardless of how well we'd prepared for cold weather survival. I started researching escape routes and alternative shelter locations that would be outside the projected path of glacial advancement. The problem was that moving 23 people hundreds of miles through increasingly dangerous territory would require logistics and resources we didn't have. More importantly, it would mean abandoning the shelter and supply caches we'd worked so hard to establish. The next week brought a series of rescue operations that pushed my technical climbing skills to their absolute limits. 3 separate groups of survivors were trapped in locations that required complex rope access and winter rescue techniques to reach. Each operation was more dangerous than the last, and each one reinforced how dependent regional survival had become on my specific capabilities. The first rescue involved a family trapped in a partially collapsed building where they'd been sheltering for weeks. The structure was unstable, and accessing the survivors required rappelling through damaged floors and rigging complex anchor systems to prevent further collapse. I managed to extract all 4 people, but the operation took 12 hours and nearly killed me when a floor section gave way during the evacuation. The second rescue was even more technically demanding. A group of 6 survivors was stranded on the roof of a building surrounded by flood waters that had frozen into unstable ice. Getting to them required crossing a quarter-mile of broken ice using techniques I'd learned for glacier travel, then rigging a Tyrolean traverse system to evacuate people who had no climbing experience. The third rescue almost broke me psychologically. An elderly couple was trapped in a remote cabin that was being crushed by snow loading on the roof. I reached their location after a 2-day approach through the worst weather conditions I'd ever experienced, only to find that they'd died hours before I arrived. Despite perfect planning and execution, I was too late to save them. The failed rescue brought back all the guilt and self-doubt from the Slot Canyon incident 3 years earlier. Once again, people had died while I was trying to reach them. Once again, I was left wondering if I could have moved faster, taken bigger risks, made different decisions that might have saved their lives. But the psychological impact was complicated by the knowledge that these rescue operations were keeping dozens of other people alive. My technical skills had successfully extracted 37 survivors from situations that would have been fatal. without intervention. The climbing techniques I'd developed for recreation and sport had become tools for saving lives on a scale I'd never imagined possible. Day 60 brought the intelligence that made me realize our survival timeline was much shorter than I'd been planning for. During a reconnaissance mission to monitor glacial advancement, I observed ice movement that was accelerating beyond anything I'd seen in the previous weeks. What had been gradual daily advancement was now visible hour-by-hour progression down the mountain valleys. Day 60 brought the sight that changed everything about our survival strategy. From my observation post on the radio tower 30 miles out, I watched through binoculars as the wall of ice advancing down the mountain valleys moved 300 yards in a single day. That wasn't glacial movement in any normal sense. That was an ice sheet advancing at speeds that meant our current location would be overrun within weeks, not months. I spent 6 hours on that tower taking measurements and tracking the movement patterns. Using landmarks I'd identified during previous reconnaissance missions, I could calculate the rate of advancement with frightening precision. The leading edge of the ice was moving roughly 50 yards per day during cold periods, and up to 100 yards when weather conditions were particularly severe. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. Our base was approximately 12 miles from the current ice front. At the observed rate of advancement, we had maybe 40 days before the glacier reached our position. But that calculation assumed the advancement rate would remain constant, and everything I was observing suggested it was accelerating as the ice mass grew larger and heavier. When I returned to base that evening, I called a group meeting to explain what I'd seen. The reaction was exactly what I'd expected. Some people wanted to start evacuating immediately. Others insisted we could defend our position or wait for the ice to stop advancing. A few suggested that my observations were wrong, that glaciers couldn't possibly move that fast under any circumstances. Lisa Chun, our logistics coordinator, asked the question that cut to the heart of our dilemma. Where exactly were we supposed to go, moving 23 people hundreds of miles through hostile territory in winter conditions? Was a logistical nightmare that could easily kill more people than staying put. We had elderly members, small children, and individuals with medical conditions that made long-distance travel extremely dangerous. I explained that our options were limited, but not impossible. There were cliff-face shelters and cave systems about 30 miles south that would be above the projected path of glacial advancement. Getting there would require a technical descent down a frozen cliff face that was over 1,000 feet high. Not impossible with proper equipment and technique, but extremely dangerous for people with no climbing experience. The alternative was to attempt a longer evacuation route that stayed on relatively flat terrain, but required traveling over 100 miles through territory that was increasingly controlled by hostile survivor groups. That route would take weeks to complete and would require resources we didn't have for such an extended expedition. Jake Rodriguez, who'd been helping me with reconnaissance and supply missions, pointed out something I'd been trying not to think about. Even if we successfully evacuated to a location outside the glacial path, we'd be starting over with minimal supplies in an area we didn't know, during the worst weather conditions any of us had ever experienced. David Chun, our paramedic, raised the medical implications of either evacuation option. Moving people with respiratory problems caused by ash exposure through extreme cold could trigger medical emergencies we wouldn't be able to treat. Several of our group members were barely stable under current conditions, and the stress of evacuation could easily kill them. Sarah Morrison asked about the possibility of partial evacuation, moving the most vulnerable people first while maintaining a base camp for those who could better handle extreme conditions. It was a reasonable suggestion, but it would mean splitting our group and dividing our limited resources between two locations. The debate continued for hours, but I knew the decision was ultimately mine to make. People were looking to me for leadership, not just because of my technical skills, but because I'd been right about most of the major decisions we'd faced since the eruption. The pressure of that responsibility was becoming almost unbearable. Over the next week, I conducted daily reconnaissance missions to track the ice advancement and scout potential evacuation routes. What I found convinced me that we were facing the most dangerous decision of the entire crisis. The ice was not only advancing faster than my initial calculations, but it was also changing the landscape in ways that were eliminating our evacuation options. The flat terrain route that might have been passable a week earlier was now blocked by ice dams that had created massive flooding, followed by freeze events that left impassable ice fields. The technical cliff descent route was still viable, but weather conditions were making it more dangerous. Every day, as ice accumulation increased the risk of rockfall and anchor failure. More critically, the advancing ice was pushing wildlife and human refugees ahead of it in massive displacement events. I encountered groups of 50 or more people trying to move south with inadequate equipment and no clear destination. Many of them were dying from exposure, starvation, and medical conditions they couldn't treat. The evacuation routes were becoming clogged with desperate people who were competing violently for resources. During one reconnaissance mission, I witnessed something that haunts me to this day. A group of about 30 survivors was attempting to cross a frozen river when the ice gave way under the weight of their loaded vehicles. I watched from a distance as people and equipment disappeared into water that was cold enough to kill in minutes. There were maybe 6 survivors from that group, and they had no supplies or shelter. I made the decision to attempt a rescue using ice climbing techniques to reach the survivors and technical rope systems to extract them from the riverbank where they were trapped. It was a complex operation that took most of a day and required equipment I couldn't afford to lose. But I managed to save 4 of the 6 people, bringing our group total to 27. The rescue operation taught me something important about the psychological pressure I was under. Every time I encountered people in life-threatening situations, I felt compelled to attempt a rescue regardless of the risk to myself or the resources it consumed. The guilt from the failed rescue 3 years ago was driving me to take increasingly dangerous chances to save people I encountered during reconnaissance missions. But it also reinforced how dependent regional survival had become on my specific technical capabilities. In a landscape where normal transportation was impossible and shelter locations required climbing skills to access, I was often the only person within 100 miles who could reach trapped survivors. The responsibility was crushing, but it was also the reality of our situation. Day 68 brought the weather event that forced our evacuation decision. A storm system moved through the region that combined the worst elements of everything we'd experienced since the eruption. Heavy snow, freezing rain, wind gusts strong enough to damage buildings, and a temperature drop that made outdoor survival impossible without technical cold weather gear. But what made this storm unprecedented was its duration. Instead of lasting 1 or 2 days like previous weather events, it continued for 5 straight days with conditions that prevented any outdoor activity. We were trapped in our base with no ability to monitor ice advancement, conduct supply runs, or communicate with other survivor groups. By the time the storm cleared, the landscape outside our base had changed dramatically. Snow accumulation was now over 6 feet deep in most areas, with drifts that reached the roofline of single-story buildings. More importantly, the advancing ice front was now visible from our base without binoculars, a wall of white that stretched across the entire northern horizon. I climbed the tallest structure I could access near our base and used surveying techniques to measure the distance to the ice front. What I found eliminated any remaining debate about evacuation timing. The glacier had advanced over 4 miles during the 5-day storm, and the leading edge was now less than 8 miles from our position. At that rate of advancement, we had maybe 2 weeks before the ice reached our base. But the acceleration I was observing suggested the timeline could be much shorter. As the ice mass grew larger and the regional temperature continued dropping, the advancement rate was increasing exponentially rather than remaining constant. I called another group meeting and laid out the situation with brutal honesty. We had perhaps 10 days to complete an evacuation that would require technical climbing skills most of our group didn't possess, in weather conditions that could kill anyone who made a significant mistake. The alternative was to remain in place and hope the ice advancement slowed or stopped before reaching our position. The vote was closer than I'd expected, but the majority decided to attempt the technical cliff descent to the cave systems I'd identified during reconnaissance. It was an enormous risk, but staying meant certain death when the glacier arrived. At least the evacuation gave us a chance of survival, even if the odds weren't good. The next week was spent in intensive preparation for the most dangerous operation any of us had ever attempted. I had to train people with no climbing experience in rappelling techniques, anchor systems, and emergency procedures. Every piece of equipment had to be checked and double-checked, because equipment failure during the descent would be fatal. Lisa Chun organized our supplies into loadouts that each person could carry during the descent. Food, water, medical supplies, shelter materials, and essential equipment had to be distributed among 27 people in packages that wouldn't interfere with climbing safety. We had to abandon most of our accumulated supplies and focus only on items essential for immediate survival. Sarah Morrison and David Chun prepared medical kits for treating injuries during the descent and established protocols for handling medical emergencies on the cliff face. They identified the people most likely to have problems during the evacuation and developed specific plans for assisting them through the technical portions of the descent. Jake Rodriguez helped me scout the cliff face and establish the anchor systems we'd need for safely lowering 27 people down a 1,000-foot vertical drop. We placed over 50 individual anchor points using climbing hardware I'd accumulated over 20 years of guiding, creating redundant systems that could handle multiple simultaneous rappels. The psychological preparation was almost as important as the technical planning. Most of our group had never been exposed to heights greater than a few stories, and they were about to attempt a descent that would terrify experienced climbers. Under ideal conditions, I had to convince people that they could trust their lives to equipment and techniques they didn't understand. Day 76 brought the final reconnaissance mission that confirmed our evacuation timeline. The ice front was now less than 5 miles from our base and advancing visibly during the hours I spent observing it. More critically, the advancing glacier was pushing a wave of displaced air ahead of it that was creating wind conditions strong, enough to make cliff face operations extremely dangerous. I also observed something that added a new element of urgency to our situation. The advancing ice was not just moving forward, but also flowing around obstacles and filling valleys in ways that were changing the landscape topology. Areas that had been accessible during my previous reconnaissance were now buried under hundreds of feet of ice. The cave system that was our evacuation destination was still accessible, but the approach routes were being modified by ice flow patterns that could cut off access if we delayed much longer. We had perhaps 72 hours to complete the evacuation before our escape route might be eliminated entirely. That evening, I gathered everyone together for what I knew might be our last night in the shelter that had kept us alive for over 2 months. The mood was tense but determined. People understood that we were about to attempt something that could easily kill all of us, but they also understood that staying meant certain death when the glacier arrived. I went through the evacuation procedure one final time, explaining each step of the descent and the safety protocols that could save their lives if something went wrong. I assigned climbing partners based on experience levels and physical capabilities, pairing stronger climbers with people who might need assistance during the descent. The equipment distribution took most of the night. Every person needed a climbing harness, helmet, rappel device, and emergency gear. I'd modified standard climbing equipment to make it easier for beginners to use, but the technical nature of the descent meant that everyone's life would depend on properly operating gear they'd only practiced with for a few days. Jake and Emma Morrison, the twins who'd been with us since the first day, asked me privately if I thought we were all going to make it. I told them the truth, that some of us might not survive the descent, but that staying behind meant certain death for everyone. They were 16 years old now, aged beyond their years by experiences no teenager should ever face, but they were also tougher and more capable than most adults I'd known before the crisis. Day 78 was spent moving all our gear to the base of the cliff and conducting final safety checks on every piece of equipment. The weather was holding stable, but I could see storm clouds building on the horizon that would make the descent impossible if they arrived before we completed the evacuation. The cliff face itself was a mixed climb requiring different techniques at different elevations. The upper portion was steep but relatively straightforward, rappelling down rock faces that were solid and predictable. The middle section involved navigating around ice formations and unstable rock that could shift without warning. The lower portion required complex anchor systems to manage the final descent to the cave entrance. I spent the day rigging the upper anchor systems and establishing communication protocols for coordinating multiple simultaneous rappels. With 27 people and limited equipment, we'd have to descend in groups of 4 or 5, with each group carrying gear for the people who would follow. The psychological pressure of being responsible for everyone's survival during the descent was unlike anything I'd experienced during 20 years of climbing. In normal circumstances, climbers accept personal responsibility for their own safety and understand the risks they're taking. But most of our group had no understanding of climbing risks and were trusting their lives entirely to my judgment and technical skills. That night, I barely slept, going over every detail of the descent plan and trying to anticipate problems that could kill people during the evacuation. Equipment failures, medical emergencies, weather changes, and human errors were all potential catastrophes that I had to be prepared to handle while managing a complex technical operation. Day 79 brought the sight that eliminated any remaining uncertainty about our timeline. The wall of ice was now less than 3 miles from our base and advancing at a rate that was visible hour by hour. The temperature had dropped to 40 below zero, and the advancing glacier was creating its own weather system with winds strong enough to knock a person off their feet. I made the final decision to begin the descent that morning, knowing that delaying another day might mean losing our window of opportunity entirely. The weather was stable, our equipment was ready, and everyone understood their role in the evacuation procedure. But as I stood at the edge of that 1,000-foot cliff with 26 people depending on me to get them safely down, I was confronted with the possibility that my technical skills might not be enough to save everyone. The descent would require perfect execution under extreme conditions, and there would be no second chances if something went wrong. The wall of ice was advancing behind us at a rate that meant we had perhaps 18 hours to complete an operation. That could easily take twice that long if we encountered problems. Everything I'd learned in 20 years of climbing was about to be tested in the most consequential rescue operation of my life. Day 80 began at 4 in the morning with me checking every anchor point one final time before we started the descent. The wall of ice was now close enough that I could hear it, a low grinding sound like massive machinery working in the distance. We had maybe 12 hours before the glacier reached our cliff face, and the descent would take at least 10 hours. If everything went perfectly, I started with the anchor systems at the top of the cliff, using headlamp light to inspect every piece of gear that would hold the lives of 27 people during the most dangerous operation any of us had ever attempted. 3 bomber cams wedged into a horizontal crack, backed up with nuts and pitons, connected to a master point with redundant slings. Each anchor had to be perfect because there would be no second chances once people started rappelling. The first group down would be Jake Rodriguez and 3 of our strongest climbers. Their job was to establish intermediate anchors and guide stations at the 200-foot level, where we'd transition from the easy upper cliff to the technical middle section. They carried extra rope and hardware to set up the complex rigging we'd need for the more difficult portions of the descent. I watched Jake check his rappel device one more time before stepping backward off the cliff edge. He'd learned basic climbing skills during our months together, but this was far beyond anything he'd attempted before. His technique was solid but careful, taking twice as long as an experienced climber would need. That was fine. Speed was important, but staying alive was more important. The second group included Sarah Morrison and David Chen, our medical team, along with 2 of the rescue survivors we'd picked up during recent operations. They carried the bulk of our medical supplies and emergency equipment that we'd need if anyone got injured during the descent. Sarah had never rappelled before a week ago, but her nursing background gave her the kind of calm competence that translated well to technical climbing. By 7 in the morning, we had 12 people safely down to the first station. The middle section of the cliff was where things would get really dangerous. Ice formations had created overhangs and unstable sections that required complex anchor systems and careful route finding. This was where my 20 years of climbing experience would either save everyone or get us all killed. I rappelled down to the intermediate station to personally rig the anchors for the technical middle section. The rock was solid, but ice accumulation made every handhold and foothold potentially unstable. I placed anchors using techniques I'd learned for mixed ice and rock climbing, creating redundant systems that could handle dynamic loading if someone fell during the descent. The third group included Tom Morrison and the teenage twins, Jake and Emma. Tom had struggled with basic climbing techniques during our training, but the twins had adapted quickly with the fearlessness that comes naturally to 16-year-olds. I paired Tom with his daughter Emma, knowing that she could coach him through the technical sections, where his lack of experience might get him in trouble. Watching Emma Morrison guide her father through the rappel sequences reminded me why we were risking everything to reach safety. These kids had lost their normal childhood when Yellowstone erupted, but they gained skills and maturity that most adults never develop. If we could get them through this descent, they'd have survival capabilities that could keep them alive in a world that no longer operated by the old rules. The weather was holding stable, but I could see storm clouds building to the west that would make the descent impossible if they arrived before we finished. More immediately dangerous was the approaching wall of ice, now close enough that falling chunks were starting to rain down on the upper portions of the cliff face. We had maybe 8 hours left before our escape route was cut off entirely. Group 4 included Lisa Chun and 3 of the families we'd rescued during recent operations. Lisa had proven to be one of our most capable members, but she was also responsible for carrying critical supplies that we couldn't afford to lose if something went wrong. I distributed the load among multiple people to reduce the risk of losing everything in a single accident. The middle section of the descent required everyone to navigate around ice formations that could collapse without warning. I'd rigged fixed lines and intermediate anchors to minimize exposure time, but each person still had to make technical moves that would challenge experienced climbers under ideal conditions. One mistake could trigger a fall that would kill not just the person who fell, but potentially anyone below them on the cliff. By 10 in the morning, we had 20 people safely through the technical middle section and beginning the final descent to the cave entrance. This lower portion required different skills, with complex anchor systems to manage multiple simultaneous rappels through overhanging rock that couldn't be protected with traditional climbing techniques. Group 5 included Pete Kowalski, our oldest member at 68, along with 2 of the rescue survivors who had medical conditions that made the descent particularly dangerous for them. Pete had been climbing longer than I'd been alive, but age and arthritis made technical rope work much harder for him than it had been in his younger years. I assigned Jake Rodriguez to stay with this group and provide assistance with anchor, transitions, and rope management. The final two groups would include our most vulnerable members, the small children and elderly survivors who couldn't safely manage technical climbing, regardless of their motivation or preparation. Getting them down the cliff would require rigging complex haul systems and potentially carrying some people who couldn't rappel independently. Around 11 o'clock, disaster nearly struck when one of the intermediate anchors began to fail under repeated loading from multiple rappels. The piton I'd placed as backup protection started working loose from the rock, and the entire anchor system began shifting in ways that could cause catastrophic failure. I had to re-rig the entire station while people were still rappelling, working around active ropes and scared climbers who didn't understand how close we'd come to losing multiple lives. The anchor failure reminded me that we were operating with no safety margin for equipment problems or technical failures. Every piece of gear was being pushed beyond its normal limits, and we didn't have backup systems for critical anchor points. One significant equipment failure could trap people on the cliff face with no way to continue the descent or return to the top. Group 6 descended without major problems, but I could see that people were getting tired and making small mistakes. That could become fatal errors during the most technical portions of the descent. Fatigue was affecting judgment and coordination in ways that made everyone more vulnerable to accidents. I had to balance speed against safety, knowing that moving too slowly could get us trapped by the advancing ice, but moving too fast could get people killed by preventable mistakes. By noon, we had 24 people safely down to the final anchor station above the cave entrance. The last descent required lowering people through an overhanging section where they couldn't touch the rock face, completely dependent on anchor systems and rope management. This was the most technically demanding portion of the entire operation, requiring climbing skills that none of our group members possessed except for Jake Rodriguez and myself. The approaching wall of ice was now close enough that we could feel the temperature change it was creating. The air was noticeably colder and moving in strange patterns as the massive ice mass displaced the normal atmospheric circulation. Chunks of ice and debris were falling more frequently, forcing me to time the final descents around the intervals when falling objects weren't threatening the cliff face. Group 7 was just me and the two remaining children, both under 8 years old, who couldn't safely rappel independently under any circumstances. I had to rig a complex haul system that would allow me to lower them while rappelling myself, maintaining control of their descent while managing my own safety through the most technical section of the cliff. The haul system required gear I'd never used. In combination before, connecting my rappel device to a pulley system that distributed their weight while giving me control over descent speed and anchor placement. If any component of the system failed, both children would fall to their deaths, and I'd probably be pulled off the cliff trying to arrest their fall. Lowering 8-year-old Michael Chun, David's son, through the overhanging section was the most terrifying thing I'd ever done as a climber. He was completely helpless, hanging in space 40 feet above the cave entrance, trusting his life entirely to equipment and techniques he couldn't understand. His calm acceptance of the situation reminded me that children adapt to extreme circumstances better than adults, but it also reinforced the enormous responsibility I carried for keeping him alive. The final descent with 6-year-old Rebecca Martinez was complicated by wind conditions created by the advancing glacier. The ice mass was now generating its own weather system, with gusting winds that could slam a small child against the rock, faced with enough force to cause serious injury. I had to time the descent around wind lulls and use additional protection to prevent her from being blown into unstable rock sections. By 2 in the afternoon, all 27 members of our group were safely inside the cave system that would be our new home. The relief was overwhelming, but it was also temporary. We'd successfully escaped the advancing glacier, but we were now living in an underground shelter, with minimal supplies during the worst winter conditions any of us had ever experienced. The cave entrance was partially concealed by rock formations. That would help protect us from both weather and detection by hostile survivor groups. More importantly, the cave system extended back into the cliff face far enough to provide shelter for our entire group, with room for supplies and equipment storage. I'd chosen this location during reconnaissance specifically because it offered long-term survival potential rather than just temporary refuge. But the successful descent had cost us most of our accumulated supplies. We'd been forced to abandon the food stores, fuel supplies, and equipment we'd gathered over 3 months of careful scavenging. We were starting over with maybe 2 weeks of food and minimal heating fuel during conditions that would require both food and fuel to survive until spring. The psychological impact of the successful evacuation was complicated. People were relieved to have escaped the advancing glacier, but they were also terrified by the realization that we were now living in a cave with winter conditions that could last for months. The technical challenges we'd overcome during the descent were obvious and dramatic, but the survival challenges we now face were more subtle and potentially more dangerous. Jake Rodriguez helped me establish security protocols for the cave entrance and interior passages. The cave system was large enough that we could get lost in the deeper sections, and complex enough that we needed clear navigation procedures to prevent people from becoming separated from the group. We also needed to control access to the entrance, to prevent discovery by hostile survivors who might try to take our shelter by force. Lisa Chun resumed her logistics responsibilities, inventorying our remaining supplies and establishing rationing protocols that might keep us alive until spring. The numbers weren't encouraging. Even with strict rationing, our food would last maybe 3 weeks. We'd need to establish reliable methods for gathering additional resources from the surrounding area, which would require technical climbing skills to access locations other scavengers couldn't reach. Sarah Morrison and David Chun set up a medical station in one of the larger cave chambers and began treating injuries and exhaustion from the descent. Several people had minor rope burns and bruises from contact with rock faces. More seriously, the stress and physical demands of the evacuation had triggered respiratory problems in people who were still recovering from volcanic ash exposure. The temperature inside the cave was stable at around 38 degrees, which was survivable with proper clothing and shelter, but not comfortable for long-term habitation. We'd need to establish heating systems using materials we could scavenge from the surrounding area, while being careful not to create carbon monoxide hazards in the enclosed space. Over the next few days, I conducted reconnaissance missions from the cave to assess our new situation and identify resource opportunities. The advancing glacier had completely transformed the landscape, burying most of the structures and supply sources we'd been using during our months at the original base. We were now living in a world that had been set back to pre-industrial conditions, but without the knowledge and infrastructure that had allowed people to survive in those conditions historically. The view from high points near the cave showed the true scale of what had happened to our region. The wall of ice now extended from horizon to horizon, a white expanse that covered everything north of our position. Towns, highways, and farmland had completely disappeared under hundreds of feet of glacial ice that was continuing to advance southward. But I also identified opportunities that could help us survive through the winter. The cliff faces around our cave contained other shelter sites that could serve as supply caches or emergency refuges. More importantly, the technical climbing required to access these locations meant that we'd face less competition from other survivor groups who lacked the skills to reach elevated resources. Day 90 brought the first major test of our new survival systems. A severe storm moved through the region with wind, snow, and temperature conditions that made leaving the cave impossible for 3 straight days. We were completely isolated from the outside world, dependent entirely on the supplies and equipment we'd managed to salvage during the evacuation. The storm also tested our group dynamics under the stress of close confinement. 27 people. Living in a cave system with no privacy and minimal personal space created tensions that hadn't been problems when we'd had more room and better conditions at our original base. I found myself mediating disputes and managing conflicts that threatened to divide the group when unity was essential for survival. But the storm experience also demonstrated how much we'd learned about cooperation and resource management during our months of crisis survival. People automatically implemented rationing protocols, shared body heat for warmth, and organized work shifts for essential tasks without needing direction from leadership. We'd become a functioning survival community, rather than just a group of individuals depending on my technical skills. By day 95, we'd established sustainable systems for heating, water collection, food storage, and waste management that could support our group through the rest of the winter. More importantly, I'd trained 6 people in basic climbing, techniques that allowed them to assist with supply runs and reconnaissance missions to elevated locations around our cave shelter. The training program was essential for reducing our dependence on my individual capabilities. If something happened to me during a supply mission, the group now had people who could attempt basic climbing operations to gather resources and maintain contact with other survivor communities. It wasn't a complete solution, but it provided some redundancy for our most critical survival functions. Day 100 brought clear weather and stable conditions that allowed me to conduct a comprehensive assessment of our situation and prospects for long-term survival. The advancing glacier had stabilized about 2 miles north of our position, creating a new landscape that was permanently changed from anything that had existed before the eruption. From my observation posts on the cliff faces above our cave, I could see other survivor groups establishing settlements in locations that were outside the glacial advance zone. Smoke columns from heating fires, movement patterns that suggested organized communities, and even some primitive communication attempts using mirror signals during sunny periods. The regional population had been reduced by probably 90% from pre-eruption levels, but the survivors were beginning to adapt to conditions that were going to persist for years or decades. The technical skills that had kept our group alive during the initial crisis were now becoming the foundation for rebuilding some kind of civilization in a world that operated by completely different rules. But I also understood that our survival through the first 100 days was just the beginning of a much longer test. The Ice Age conditions triggered by the volcanic eruption were going to persist long after the immediate effects of the ash and temperature drop had ended. We were living in a permanently changed world that would require different skills, different social organizations, and different relationships with the natural environment. The climbing techniques that had saved our lives during the evacuation were now our primary means of accessing resources, maintaining security, and communicating with other survivor communities. In a landscape where normal transportation was impossible and most infrastructure had been destroyed, the ability to move vertically as well as horizontally was becoming essential for any kind of organized human activity. Looking back on those first 100 days, I realized that every decision we'd made, every skill we'd learned, and every risk we'd taken had been preparation for this moment. We'd survived the immediate crisis, but we'd also adapted to become the kind of people who could thrive in a world where climbing skills were the difference between life and death. Our group of 27 people was now a functioning community with the technical capabilities, resource management systems, and social organization needed to survive indefinitely in Ice Age conditions. We'd proven that it was possible to adapt quickly enough to stay alive when the fundamental rules of survival changed overnight. The Ice Age that started with the Yellowstone eruption was going to last for decades, and the world that emerged from it would be completely different from the one we'd known before. But we demonstrated that people with the right skills, the right mindset, and the willingness to take calculated risks could not just survive that transition, but build the foundation for whatever came next. Those first 100 days taught me that in a world where normal rules no longer applied, the ability to climb might be the most important survival skill anyone could possess. And that was just the beginning of our story in the new world that the ice had created.